A few minutes and think about homosexuality and Christian ethics. In particular, we're going to begin with asking, why is this such a hot issue in the Christian churches today? As we think through this issue, and especially as we will have further discussions in class, we're going to want to keep in mind our ethics toolkit. And within that, we might start to uncover some of the theological reasons for this ongoing controversy. In particular, I think we can identify that the Bible, tradition, reason, and experience are all at stake in this issue, especially how those are interpreted, the Bible and tradition and experience in particular, and how they are applied, and what kind of weight do we give to each one of those sources. Let's begin with, how has this issue been seen? I want to outline very quickly four different approaches to homosexuality in the Christian tradition and Christian churches. The first one summed up in the love the sinner, hate the sin. Hate and reject the sin, but love and accept the sinner. Here, note that those who are homosexual and engage in homosexual practice are regarded right off the bat as sinners. Homosexual orientation in this understanding, however, is not necessarily sinful, but certainly disordered, to use the language that comes from the Roman Catholic Church. But homosexual acts, homosexual sexual intercourse, is definitely sinful. So that is the love the sinner, hate the sin approach. The second approach is limited acceptance. Homosexual orientation is seen as not sinful, but homosexual relations are seen as less good than heterosexual relations. This was an attempt by a moral theologian by the name of Charles Curran to think through this issue from the standpoint of a kind of a just war approach. So the presumption is the normativity, the full goodness of heterosexual relations, but that we are in a fallen, sinful world. What kind of moral guidance could we provide to those who are homosexual and engage in homosexual relations, to say they're not outright rejected, but they need to be structured in a way that's consistent with Christian sexual ethics. Next is full acceptance, a third option, a third approach. Here, homosexuality and homosexual sexual union are seen as having the exact same moral legitimacy as heterosexuality and heterosexual union, and they're under the same moral imperatives as heterosexuality. So this is basically the approach in what are often called the welcoming and affirming churches. Finally, rejecting and punitive. Here, both the homosexual orientation and homosexual sexual activity are evil. The orientation's evil, the union is evil. Thus, homosexuals are sinful in their very being and are to be condemned in their very being and punished for simply being homosexual. This is the Reverend Fred Phelps approach. God hates fags. That's the language that he uses. This approach, I would say, is really outside the pale of what could be a Christian approach. But why the diversity of these positions? What's feeding these different positions within Christianity, with that fourth one on the margins? Do we see homosexuality as a choice or as an orientation? Those who see it as a choice often talk about the homosexual lifestyle, as if there is such a lifestyle, but they wouldn't use the same kind of language to talk about a heterosexual lifestyle. It's not seen as a choice. Behind this diversity as well are natural law arguments. And we'll go into those in a bit more detail in a minute. And certainly biblical interpretation. One side says we should understand Scripture to say homosexual behavior is sinful. The other says it's a gift from God, just like heterosexual relations. These are pretty different positions. So let's begin with that question of, do we see homosexuality as a choice or as an orientation? And our source here is really from experience, the human sciences, particularly psychology. Homosexuality as an orientation would say that this is just a given. This is the way people are. And this is, Roman Catholic Church sees orientation as a reality. Even evangelical Protestant ethicists, Clake and Rakestraw, in their book Readings in Christian Ethics, recognize the reality of a homosexual orientation. American Psychological Association states human beings cannot choose to be either gay or straight. Sexual orientation emerges for most people in early adolescence without any prior sexual experience. Psychologists do not consider sexual orientation to be a conscious choice that can be voluntarily changed. This gets to that whole issue of reparative therapy, which has been pretty severely debunked by mainstream psychological studies. Homosexuality as a choice, you'll find this in the people who do think that those reparative therapies work. So Exodus International is an example of this. The National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality is another example. You can look these up on the web if you wish to. What's the moral significance, though, of this orientation versus choice? Well, moral responsibility depends upon the degree of freedom that we have. We can really only be held morally accountable for that which we choose. So if we're choosing homosexual orientation or choosing to be homosexual, then we can be held morally accountable for that. If it's not a choice, if it's a given orientation, then the orientation becomes a kind of a non-issue in and of itself. Related to that argument are natural law arguments. Here more of tradition as a source. There's a biologist view of natural law that says that the function of the body reveals natural law. So since sexual organs in humans have the same natural law purpose as they do in any animals, namely procreation. So homosexuality is immoral because it is closed by its very nature to procreation, and also violates, as we'll discuss in just a minute or two, the complementarity of the genders. Closed to procreation, keep in mind that this emphasis is on by its very nature. That is, homosexual sexual intercourse may never result in procreation, whereas heterosexual sexual intercourse, at least by its nature, can and often does result in procreation, even though some heterosexual sex will not result in procreation. The rationalist natural law approach would criticize this and say that the purposes of sexual union between humans are not given by a biological function, but rather they're given by what is specific to sexual union between humans, and that takes us back to the unitive, to the partnership, the coming together of two human beings is what distinguishes human sexual intercourse. So let's move to this complementarity argument. This is the one that is God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. That's the kind of gross, crass way of getting to the complementarity argument. The more sophisticated argument says God's creative intent in making us male and female is that our sexuality and sexual practice express gender differentiation between male and female. So homosexual union goes against that kind of differentiation. Now, there's a critique of this complementariness. They said sexuality is not just a given, but it's socially constructed. And it also fails to account for diversity, the diversity that exists in human sexuality. Most researchers into human sexuality look upon sexual orientation as a kind of continuum, with those who are 100% heterosexual over here, 100% homosexual over here, and then the vast majority of us are on this line between those two extremes. We also may note, as has been noted in history, that gender roles change and vary from culture to culture and in different time periods. For example, you could read Peter Stern's Gender in World History. those are the kind of natural law arguments and the ones from experience. But the big arguments in most Protestant churches, at least, though also in the Catholic Church to a lesser extent, is around the Bible and interpretations of the Bible. So what I want to do is not settle that argument so much, but to say that we have 4 questions for the Bible in relationship to the morality of homosexuality. First, we want to ask, does the Bible unquestionably condemn homosexuality as an orientation? Second, we'll ask, does the Bible unquestionably condemn all homosexual sexual relationships or actions? Third, does the Bible unquestionably condemn some kinds of homosexual actions? Now, how we answer those 3 questions will reflect how we interpret the Bible, what our approach to biblical texts are. So one reason this issue is so divisive, as I indicated earlier, is because there are competing biblical interpretations. So let's think at first 2 major issues for the Bible to address: Bible and homosexuality as an orientation, the Bible and homosexuality in terms of homosexual sexual intercourse. Key for both issues, again, is this interpretation of the Bible. Are we kind of in the historical, critical, contextual camp, or are we taking the more fundamentalist approach to biblical interpretation? So now let's turn to the Bible and homosexuality as an orientation. That is, does the Bible see homosexuality as an orientation? In answering that question, the short answer is no. Why? Because sexual orientation itself is a modern understanding within human sexuality. Homosexuality as a term indicating sexual orientation, therefore, is not even in ancient Hebrew or Greek. The word homosexual and homosexuality was coined in 1869 in Gustav Jaeger's book, Discovery of the Soul. So it doesn't really even become a standard term until later into the late 1800s of this sense of a fixed sexual orientation. So this is why we have these language problems in the Hebrew and the Greek, because there's no word, Hebrew or Greek word, that is directly translatable to homosexuality understood as an orientation. Translators for the King James Bible, and that translation is back in 1611, coined a word for the Hebrew word Qadesh and the Greek word malakoi and arsenokoite, and the word they coined was sodomite, clearly based upon the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and their understanding of that particular story, which we'll look into in more detail. So Bible does not condemn homosexuality as an orientation because it doesn't even have the understanding of orientation, sexual orientation, one way or the other. It's foreign to biblical understanding. So let's turn to the Bible and homosexual sexual relationships, sexual actions, sexual intercourse. We should note at the outset there are not very many references to this through the Bible. No, it's not a major concern of the Bible. There's at best 4 references that we could draw upon in the Hebrew Scriptures or Old Testament, and at best in the New Testament there are 6, with 2 of those being quite obscure and really not directly pertaining to the argument that we're going to look at today. So we will look at each of these in the class in more detail, but for now I'm going to do, like I said, a kind of a quick overview so we have a sense of where the arguments are going. So the method of interpretation, again, is going to be key. We're going to either come out with a kind of view supporting the rejecting, love the sinner, hate the sin, or we'll come out with a sort of affirming and welcoming. But the view, the supporting, rejecting, and this rejecting all the way, sees that the Bible clearly condemns homosexual sexual actions as always sinful, now and forever into the future. Revelation can't be changed. The Bible gives us unchanging moral truth. without the need for attention to the historical and cultural context in which the texts were written. Now, if we're moving from a limited to full acceptance, we're probably going to be in the area of contextual, historical, critical interpretation of the Bible. Folks who take this approach are going to point to three things within the biblical text that start to affect the texts that we're going to look at. Those three things are purity code, that there are prohibitions on certain behaviors as unclean. Those that we're going to see have a kind of mixture of moral teaching and ritual teaching. Secondly, an honor culture, that there's respect due to certain persons because of their social standing, and that's how social relations are structured in the biblical world, both Hebrew Scriptures and New Testament. And then third, patriarchy, a patriarchal society. Males were dominant, and an honorable male, going back to the honor culture, controls his possessions and his body. So homosexual sexual actions violate this male dominance and male role in reproduction. And think here primarily we're looking at male homosexual sexual actions. That's what the Bible is going to be almost 100% concerned about, with one small possible reference in Paul's letter to the Romans to same-sex relations between women. So key question then becomes, are these cultural time-bound assumptions of purity code, honor culture, and patriarchy evident in the biblical texts that refer to homosexual sexual actions? Now let's dive into some of these texts. The Hebrew Bible, the Sodom and Gomorrah story, Genesis 19, verses 1 to 29. What we can see in this story, it is not a sexual morality tale. It is a story about patriarchal honor culture and hospitality. Who is Lot? Well, he's Abraham's nephew. And so Lot's honor and Abraham's honor are tied together. Why were the angels, the men present in Sodom with Lot in the first place? Because they were angels who had been sent on an inspection tour of Sodom where Lot was living. Sodom and Gomorrah are revealed as cities without honor. There's no one even at the gates to welcome strangers. But the stranger Lot, the foreigner Lot, does offer hospitality and dishonors the people of Sodom by doing that. Lot, as a resident alien, offers the hospitality that the residents of Sodom should have been offering. So the Sodomites, in response to Lot's dissing of them, seek to shame or dishonor Lot by a kind of double dishonor. They're going to take away the guests that are under his protection, under his hospitality, and they're going to rape those guests, same-sex rape. Lot seeks to retain his honor and to practice hospitality by keeping control over his guests, protecting them. You can see the patriarchy, though, here. He offers his daughters to be raped by the strangers, the Sodomites, who are knocking at the door. Again, this is not a sexual morality tale. It's about patriarchy and it's about honor. So what's the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah based on? Is it attempted angel rape? And I think we could all agree that angel rape is immoral. Other biblical references to Sodom and Gomorrah talk about the economic injustice that's practiced in Sodom and Gomorrah. In Ezekiel 16:49, for example, it says, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor." The other references are in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zephaniah. Those all refer to sins of injustice, oppression, partiality, adultery, lies, encouraging evildoers, not homosexual sexual intercourse. So let the Bible interpret the Bible. Sodom and Gomorrah is not about homosexual sexual relations, unless you want to talk about angel rape or homosexual rape. And everybody can agree, whether gay or not, that homosexual rape, just like heterosexual rape, is immoral. It's referenced twice. This story is referenced twice in the New Testament as well. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 10, 5 to 15, and 11, 23 to 24. But again, it's about hospitality. It's not about the sexual question. Then there are these two obscure passages in Jude 7 and 2 Peter 2, 8 to 10, that somehow get at this issue again of angel sex, and yes, it's immoral. So let's think about the broader story or verses that are in the Hebrew Bible, and then we'll move to the New Testament. So go beyond the Sodom and Gomorrah story. It's not a story that supports any kind of condemnation of homosexuals in general or homosexual sexual relationships that would be under the same norms as heterosexual sexual relationships that we've already talked about, loving and faithful covenant relationship. Sodom and Gomorrah is about rape. Old Testament words, or Hebrew scripture words, Qadesh and Toibah. These are coming from Leviticus 18:22. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Leviticus 20:13 adds, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. What we're getting here are these words, Qadesh and Toibah. Qadesh is actually a male prostitute. That's what it means. One who engaged in ritual sex in a pagan temple. This is what gets translated as sodomite in the King James Version, or in later versions, homosexual. Toibah, the one that is translated as abomination, we need to note that abomination is not simply a moral term. If you eat unclean food, that is an abomination, like in Leviticus 20:25. You shall therefore make a distinction between the clean animal and the unclean, and between the unclean bird and the clean. You shall not bring abomination on yourselves by animal or by bird or by anything with which the ground teems, which I have set apart for you to hold unclean. So it's a ritual designation. Now, sometimes, however, abomination it refers to that could be moral teaching. For example, Ezekiel 18:12 says, those who oppress the poor and needy, commits robbery, does not restore the pledge, lifts up his eyes to the idols, commits abomination. So a key question that we come out of the Hebrew scriptures is, does the condemnation of homosexual sexual actions as an abomination reflect moral law or ritual law? If it's moral law, then it should hold into the New Testament and hold then on into our own practice today. As ritual law, we've left it behind. We're not under those ritual laws. We don't have clean and unclean in terms of our foods or other actions. So let's turn to the New Testament on moral purity and patriarchy, and some bit on honor as well. Jesus, if we look at his life and teachings, rejects purity and patriarchy, does not speak directly to the issue of homosexuality, homosexual sexual intercourse, but he does reflect a tradition of heterosexual marriage. In terms of purity, Jesus taught that purity of heart and not ritual purity or other ritual actions are central to our relationship with God. In terms of patriarchy, Jesus' relation with women challenges patriarchy. You think of the woman with the flow of blood, the woman caught in adultery, Samaritan woman at the well, women as the first preachers of the resurrection, the Canaanite or Syrophoenician woman. These are all ways in which Jesus rejects that idea of the sort of the inferiority of women or their second-class standing. But what about Jesus and heterosexual marriage? Yes, in Matthew 19:4-6, he reflects the Genesis account, and he says, have you not read that he who made them in the first place made them man and woman? It says, for this reason a man will leave his father and his mother and will live with his wife. The two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Let no one divide what God has put together. A clear sort of assumption of the normativity of that heterosexual marriage. We'll come back to that as in sort of our concluding questions. What about Paul in the New Testament? Consistent with Jesus' teaching, Paul teaches that membership in the church is not based upon obedience to purity codes. Think of the circumcision controversy. And Paul also, though the record's a little bit mixed here, challenges patriarchy. Think of Galatians 3:28. In Christ there's neither male nor female. He does have, in some of the letters attributed to Paul, more of a hierarchical, patriarchal view, but there are some serious questions about Paul's authorship of those letters. So neither Jesus nor Paul justified sexual teaching by an appeal to patriarchy or to ritual purity, though Paul clearly does share Jesus' assumption of heterosexual marriage. Let's dive a little deeper into some of those passages in Paul that get so much attention and have so much controversy in their interpretation. First, Romans chapter 1, 18 to 31. Paul's cultural context is on display here. No sense of homosexual orientation, but lots of reflection on patriarchy and also a cultural practice in Paul's Greco-Roman world of pederasty, of sex between an adult male and a boy. So let's think about how Paul's reasoning here reflects culturally specific assumptions about homosexual actions. His overall point around Romans 1 is that God's judgment on the Gentiles is there, but God's judgment is on the Jews as well. None are righteous, no, not one. But the Gentiles, as the Jews in the church, have been welcomed through union with Christ. Paul clearly regards some types of homosexual actions as sinful, but the Christian response to sin is to imitate God in God's loving efforts to seek redemption. So that's the ethical message underlying Romans. We should welcome others as God has welcomed us, as Paul says in Romans 15:7. Why does Paul regard homosexual actions as sinful? It's possible that he's seen these as part of temple prostitution, or he sees homosexual sexual intercourse requires overcoming a natural desire for sex between the opposite genders. Paul might share with his time the sort of view of a super lust needed for homosexual union. It was a common view in Paul's time. Paul certainly shares the assumption that the Gentiles are idolatrous, and the primary focus in Romans 1, 18 to 32 is this on Gentiles who stop worshiping God and who exchange or substitute the worship of God for the worship of idols, and thus exchange natural for unnatural sexual relations. But we want to think about what's the basis for this condemnation. The basis here is really about idolatry worship. God gave them over. So God is saying that Paul is saying that the Gentiles exchanged God for idols and then stepped into this idol worship, which involves temple prostitution, which could be male-male prostitution or male-female prostitution, or might even be female-female prostitution. Romans 1:26, for example, is often interpreted today to refer to sex between two women, lesbian sex, and that then kind of rounds out the view that all homosexual sexual relations were condemned, not just male-male, as in the Hebrew scriptures. So there are some early interpreters, though, who would reject that. And what I mean by early are folks back in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. There are early writers, Anastasios, for example, and Augustine, who think that Paul is not referring to sex between two women, but rather men who are doing what we call today anal sex. So what to conclude from Paul, this is a tough passage. It's tough. There's a lot of different stuff going on in this passage, and we'll look at it a little bit more closely again in class. I wanted to give you kind of the contours of the argument, kind of the stuff that people raise. What about 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 10, and 1 Timothy 8 to 10? Paul's giving some vice lists here, and he does this in other of his letters and doesn't make these condemnations in those other letters. So what is Paul actually condemning here in these vice lists? Controversy swirls around the meaning of two Greek words, malakoi and arsenokoite. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 10 has both words, and then 1 Timothy only has arsenokoite. What does malakoi mean in Paul's day? It means soft. It could be applied to moral matters like, that person's loose or undisciplined or unrestrained. It also seemed to carry the word the meaning in the ancient world of effeminate, and in a patriarchal culture, that's a bad thing for a man to be called. So it could not only mean those who are the passive males in a sexual union, but lazy men, cowards, those who are decadent, enjoyed too much luxury, sort of the old Arnold Schwarzenegger term that was supposed to be derogatory, a girly man. Some have suggested, however, the word refers to boy prostitutes. Elsewhere in the New Testament, the word does appear. It appears in Matthew 11:8, and it gets translated, those in soft robes. So malakoi is the word of controversy. What about arsenokoite? Here the question is, did Paul coin this term, or is this a term that was already around in Paul's day that Paul is just using? Those who say that Paul coined the word said that he's combined two Greek words, arseno, referring to men, with koite, a word that refers to having sex with someone. And Paul's then drawing from Leviticus, the man who lies with a male like a woman. He's translating that into his own time period. He's therefore continuing the Levitical condemnation of same-sex sexual relations. That's the people who are saying Paul coined the term. There are those who say, nope, Paul didn't coin the term. It was around, it's found in ancient literature, and it refers to economic exploitation, probably by sexual means, such as rape, or sex by economic coercion, such as prostitution or pimping. So then it wouldn't be referring to homosexual sexual actions in general. Rather, it would be a reference, again, to male prostitution. So those are the arguments that sort of focus in on particular passages. There's another argument that is made these days in particular. Luke Timothy Johnson makes this argument. He says the issue here is analogous, the issue of homosexuality is analogous to the one facing earliest Christianity after the Gentiles started being converted. Could Gentiles join the body of Christ without circumcision and the law? He argues, look, in the ancient world, that division between Gentiles and Jews was as strong culturally as the division might be today between heterosexual and homosexual. We're just obsessed with the sexual dimension of the body in our culture, but the first century Mediterranean world was obsessed by the social implications of food and table fellowship. So to let the Gentiles in without having them to be circumcised, without having them to follow the kosher rules, that was a big deal. And what was the basis to let them in? Well, God's at work among the Gentiles. God is leading the church to make bold to reinterpret the Torah. And this inclusivity comes because there's evidence of holiness in the lives of the Gentiles. So we'd look at people who are homosexual today and say, is there evidence of holiness? Are there good Christian homosexuals? So that's God's working something new. There's the Holy Spirit's doing something new in our lives and saying, yes, God is active among those who are homosexual, and they should be let in, fully accepted by the church, just as the New Testament church recognized the holiness of the Gentiles. They're being bound with Christ, and so they're let in. So there's our overview. Back to our earliest questions. Does the Bible clearly condemn all homosexual activity? You can see from this that the answer hinges upon the interpretation of just a few passages. From the Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures, there's no clear condemnations if one considers the context of purity, patriarchy, honor assumptions. That is, no clear condemnations outside of temple prostitution or rape. And yes, those should be condemned, whether it's homosexual or heterosexual. Jesus says nothing directly, though. Jesus assumes the norm of heterosexual relations. He certainly condemns forms of sexual relations that are exploitative, whether those would be heterosexual or, as we think today, also whether or not they'd be homosexual. Doesn't matter. The orientation doesn't matter. It's the quality, so to speak, the moral quality of the relationships. Paul also assumes the norm of heterosexual relations, condemns forms of homosexual relations that are exploitative, i.e. prostitution. So again, there's not a blanket condemnation. What the Bible does clearly condemn in all cases is homosexual rape, homosexual prostitution, but it does the same thing with heterosexuals. Heterosexual rape and heterosexual prostitution are also condemned. So what do we conclude? How we come down on this issue is going to depend a lot on biblical interpretation, how we interpret the Bible, and also how we think through the Christian tradition here, and also how we think through what is human experience telling us at this point. What are we learning? So let's conclude with that, and we'll pick up the conversation when we get into class. Thank you.